you, Stéphane. Thank you, Barbara, for the invitation. So as you said, it's going to be a lecture and not a seminar. So what I hope that you will get from this lecture is that at the end, you will know a bit the vocabulary and some concepts that are really specific to seismic wave scattering and that you usually do not encounter in the standard curriculum that you get in earth science. Although myself, I'm an earth scientist, but if you go to the literature about scattering, there are specificities, okay, and I would like to explain some very basic concepts that I hope will be useful in general. So there will be 3 parts in my lecture. So first I will introduce really fundamental things. I will discuss about important scale lengths that you have in scattering problems and the different frequency regimes, which are very well characterized and which are important to have in mind when you look at data. Then I will answer to a very common question, is how you separate elastic from inelastic processes in attenuation. That is how you separate scattering from absorption. And to do that, I will introduce what we call transport models, which are different equations from the one you know, but which are very well established as soon as you work in media where you have heterogeneities. And then if I have time, I will discuss more about what we do nowadays with this transport theory. That is, what we try to do now is to image separately the spatial variation of the absorption and scattering properties. Okay, so I like to start with these very basic observations. So these are 2 seismograms recorded for 2 quakes. So one on the moon here and one on the Earth. The source station distance is about the same. I think it's 300 kilometers. And the time scale is the same. It's 60 minutes. Okay? And it's quite obvious that the propagation in the Earth and on the moon are completely different. In the Earth, the seismic energy that you have here is essentially transported by what we call ballistic waves, okay? Waves that propagate according to the laws of geometrical optics. And here you have you see a small P wave here, and here you have a very large S wave, okay? And then, bloof, very quickly, you return to the noise level, okay? On the moon, it's completely different. You don't see ballistic waves. You have a very emergent signal, okay? Which we call this diffuse shape, okay? And we'll explain why we call it diffuse, because there's a diffusion model for that. And so it's very slowly emergent. You see that it takes about 10 minutes to reach to the maximum of the energy, okay? So it means the propagation is certainly extremely complicated. And the signal lasts for hours, okay? Compared to the Earth, where it lasts for minutes, it's the same frequency band. It's around 1 Hertz. Okay, so I put the scale here. The problem I'm going to discuss are really important in the Earth, from periods of 10 seconds to frequencies of 10 Hertz and above. And so, with the associated wavelengths at from 100 meters to tens of kilometers. Okay, it's really in this frequency regime that I'm going to work. And of course, the huge difference between Earth and Moon is the level of attenuation. So attenuation is a word that I don't like so much because I prefer to use the word absorption, okay, to mean dissipation of seismic energy, okay. And so in this presentation, I will discuss the different mechanisms and how you can separate them. So attenuation, very often people, for attenuation, they mean absorption. Okay, so first thing I want to clarify. So I think, for example, when Barbara was saying attenuation, what she really meant was absorption, at least in my vocabulary. So attenuation, you have 2 basic mechanisms for attenuation. One is scattering. Okay, so scattering is the fact that the waves do not propagate ballistically. Okay, if the medium is heterogeneous, the waves will not propagate in straight line. They will be deviating in all directions, possible directions. And this is what you can have an idea as scattering. And so where does scattering come from? So basically it's a matter of scales. So when you take a classical seismic tomography, so for example, you do travel time tomography. So as it has been very well explained, you have to do a lot of regularization. Okay, you have to introduce damping, you have to introduce correlation, and in the end, you get a model that is smooth. Okay, and in fact, if the model is not smooth, you're not going to trust it. But this model was designed usually to explain the ballistic arrivals. Okay, so to explain this ballistic arrival, you don't need to put a lot of small scales. What requires the small scales is the fact that in addition to the ballistic arrivals, in fact, you have scattered waves. Okay, and I'm going to show a lot of examples. And if you don't put the small scale heterogeneities in your model, you're never going to explain the scattered waves. Okay, so it's the data that tell you, the seismic data, when you look at them at short period, they require the existence of small scale heterogeneities, say from tens of meters to kilometers, okay, to have an idea of scales. And a source of scattering, which I'm sure you are very convinced of, is the fact that when you're close to the surface of the Earth, you have fractures, you have cracks, and so this is discontinuous, okay, and this is going to scatter the waves. The waves cannot propagate through easily, okay. So in this talk, this type of fracture model are very complicated and they are very shallow. So for the deep Earth, usually we like to think of continuous variation of some quantity, like the seismic velocity, the density. Okay. So in this talk, I will mostly discuss this type of models. Okay. And in this model, we already introduced an important scale length. You can imagine that there is a typical size of heterogeneity, okay, and this we call a correlation length, okay? So I will use the term correlation length, and you can think of basically you have this fluctuations here. You have a typical size, this is the correlation length, okay? But you see that they fluctuate randomly. So the idea that you have to have in mind is that when we talk about scattering, okay, we think in terms of an ensemble of this type of media, okay? Yes? Absolutely, it's a very good point. I totally, I will come back on that. It's not necessarily well defined, this, and it's more interesting the fractal behavior. But just to simplify the things. Okay, and now if you go to an even more smaller scale, okay, you can imagine that at the level of pores, you can have a lot of dissipation processes, and I think which is driven by the presence of fluids of melts. So for example, you can imagine that if you have melts and you have a seismic wave that passes through, you're going to push on the material, the melt can flow, and this is going to dissipate energy. But I think there is an even more appealing and spectacular illustration of the role of fluid is the experience that we got from the return sample of the Apollo mission. So it's quite obvious when you look at the lunar data that the level of dissipation must be tremendously low, okay, compared to the Earth, okay, because of this super long duration of the signal. And actually, when the samples were brought to the lab, and people did measurements of the Q, so the dissipation, so inverse Q, they found the same thing as what you have in a basalt on Earth. So it was completely, completely contradictory. So what had happened, in fact, is that the sample just got polluted by the moisture in the air. So just a few atoms of water that you put inside a porosity is sufficient to drop your quality factor by factor of 10, that is increase the attenuation by factor of 10. And there's a guy called Titman. He did a very, very interesting series of experiments where basically he took a basalt that you collect on Earth, okay, and he cycled it. So he performed heating experiment, okay, in vacuum. So what happened when he was doing that? He was heating the material. The fluids were released. He was also breaking the material. That is, introduced a lot of defects inside the sample. And he did that 1, 2, 3, 10 times, okay? So in the end, the incompressibility modulus was completely dropped, so it means the rock was full of defects, but in spite of that, the quality factor reached the lunar value, which showed really the importance of the presence of just a few layers of water or fluid inside the sample to control the level of absorption, okay? So I think it's, so for example, in the field where I'm working now, planetology, when we think absorption, we almost immediately think about this Titman experiment and the role of just a few layers of fluids inside the porosity or at the grain boundaries. Yes? I didn't say there's no scattering at scale D. Okay. I just said that the dissipation takes place probably at this scale. And that the dissipation is not really caused by, at least, his experiments were really close to the seismic band. Huh? He was close to 50 Hz. So the first experiment was higher frequency, but the last one was torsion experiment. And what I think is also interesting to keep in mind is that it's not because you have a lot of defect in a rock that you have a lot of attenuation, a lot of dissipation. Huh? Because this is not what he found. You need to put something else. Okay, yeah, so this part, in fact, the processes that occur at this part are not going to be, except what I told you, the central topic of my talk. Huh? The central topic will be on this part, because in fact we understand a lot of things about this part. And there are a lot of things we can explain, and we know a lot of scaling relations. So the better we know this, the better we can try to extract this, okay? And maybe arrive at a description of, or at least a phenomenological idea of what happens at this scale, okay? So the scattering. So first of all, evidence for heterogeneity, direct evidence for heterogeneity, okay? So here, it's a bit busy, okay? But what you have on the left are logging data. So basically, when you do boreholes, you can measure the density and the velocity. So here you have a plot where you have the depth. So it's here up to 1.7 kilometers, okay? Here you have the P velocity, S velocity, density, okay? So you see that there are discontinuities. Of course, you have rocks of different nature, okay? But inside each layer, you see that there are these fluctuations, okay? So this is what I am talking about, okay? So of course, layers are important, okay? But you have all these small-scale fluctuations, okay, that you see in the data. And when you, so the way there are two ways to describe them. One is in the spatial domain. You compute a correlation function. That is, you have 2 points separated by a distance r, okay? And you take the average, okay, of the product of the velocity. So v is for velocity, or another parameter. You can do it for the density, okay? And you look at the resemblance between the velocity that you measure at 2 points, okay? And this defines a correlation function. So this will give you an idea of the distribution, the spatial distribution of these velocity fluctuations, okay? But in fact, for the scattering, it's much more important to think of, in terms of heterogeneity, what we call a heterogeneity power spectrum, which is just the Fourier transform, okay, of this correlation function, okay? And what is quite interesting, so I will comment this formula later, okay? But what is quite interesting is that independent of the scale at which you look at, the power spectrum is remarkably similar. So this is an example of measurement that have been done on granite, okay? So it's based on, I think it's based on micrographs. And so people were able to measure the local fluctuation, I think it's a millimeter scale here, of the velocities inside the granite, okay? And when you look at how the fluctuations are distributed over the different scale lengths, okay? So this is, here you have a wave number, okay? So this is in fact how you distribute the variance of the fluctuation over the different wave numbers, okay? You see this type of power law behavior. Here you have a corner and a plateau, but this is just, this plateau corresponds basically to the average size of the grain in the sample, okay? So this plateau here, probably, yeah, the order of maybe centimeters, something like that. So this is the grain size in the sample. So it's controlled by the size of the sample here, okay? So you do that at the scale of granite. You do that at the scale of a log here, and you get this same type of power law behavior. And again, don't pay too much attention to this. So we can imagine there is a correlation distance here, but of course, it can be dependent on the sample size, okay? So what you see is that you have this kind of universal power law behavior. So this is described by this formula. So M is the wave number that you have on this axis, okay? So it's the wave number, it describes the wavelengths of the fluctuations, okay? So large scale fluctuations are here, small scale fluctuations are here, okay? Large wave number, small scale, small wave number, large scale. Here, A is the correlation length, okay? So the typical size, or we can think also maybe even of the maximal size of your heterogeneities. And then you have this decay, which is described here by this exponent kappa. Yes?
Just a precision on the correlation function. X, I mean, you have its function of X, so you're correlating something at plus.
Yeah. So this is here there is an assumption of spatial homogeneity. The disorder is spatially homogeneous, okay? But you can imagine indeed, and this is what it will be the end of my talk, that this correlation function depends on the position. Yeah, absolutely. So here we imagine that the sample is statistically uniform. That's the word. Okay. Yeah. So you have this behavior, and epsilon squared is a quantity that measures the variance. Okay. So when you integrate over all wave numbers, okay, you get the total variance of the velocity or the density. Okay. If I'm not clear, interrupt me. Okay. And regarding the exponent, what people usually find is that it's something between, so the decay, so kappa here is something between 0 and 0.5, and in fact much closer to 0. So 0.5 is a special case. It's what we call, it corresponds to an exponential correlation. Okay. So this function here is just an exponential with a length scale a. But the data usually suggests that it's much closer to m to the minus 3, so kappa equals 0, which is in fact a marginal case, because when you put kappa equals 0 here, what happens is that this integral blows up, okay? This diverges logarithmically, because you get something like k squared divided by k to the cube, okay? So that gives you 1 over k, so it's a logarithm, okay? But the data suggests that, and I will show you an example with real seismic data that concurs with this conclusion. What else do I need to tell you? Yeah, no, another important thing, and which is important more in for when you really want to dig into the computation, the calculation, you see that in general, the correlation of the various parameters. So in the elastic wave equation, you have, well, it can be anisotropic. But when it's isotropic, you need 3 parameters, density and the 2 velocities. And you see that in general, so it represents here, it's a diagram, a scatter plot of velocity density. Here it's so p velocity density, s velocity density, and here the two velocities, p and s. And what you get from this diagram, they are rather well correlated. Okay, so these correlations are important because, well, first because they are important in terms of the scattering response of the medium, but also because they simplify a lot when you want to do the mathematics. It's good to know that you can reduce the number of independent parameters. Okay. So in general, we use this type of correlation. We assume that the spatial fluctuations of velocity, density, and the 2 velocities and the density are correlated. Okay, and that we know the correlation coefficient to some extent. Okay, so now we go to the seismic data, and we try to explain some vocabulary and make the link between this vocabulary and what we see on the seismogram. Okay, so here it's a seismogram on Earth. Now it's The scale here must be something like a few minutes, okay? So it's quite complicated at short period. It's not simple arrivals. So here I have pointed some arrivals that you can describe with ray theory. So the PN, so it's a refracted wave that goes down the crust, the mantle, and goes back up. The PG, so the wave that propagates in the crust. Here the SG phase, so the S wave that propagates in the crust. But you see that in between, you have quite a lot of arrivals, and you have these signals that lasts for quite a long time that we call the coda. Okay? So each phase, in fact, at short period, when you look at a phase, it always has some coda. Okay? So PN has a coda, PG has a coda, SG has a coda. Okay? So these are it's a generic term to denote these late arrivals, and of course these waves, they don't propagate in straight line. So this is the evidence in the seismic data that you have scattering. Okay. So now to put this thing in the scattering formalism, we are going to do this thought experiment here. Okay. So I take a chunk of scattering medium. Okay. So it has I already talked about the correlation length, and we are going to send a plane wave. It's very simple. We send the plane wave. It has a wavelength lambda. And we are going to look at the propagation through the sample. So there will be a transmitted wave, okay? So this transmitted wave will form the ballistic arrivals that we can see here. You can have a P, you can have an S, and if you have several ray paths that connect your source and your station, you can have more. So you will have, here it's very simple. So here we just have one transmitted wave, okay? And we will have all these echoes, okay, that will form. So I've drawn some trajectories here. They will form the scattered wave. Now, if you go to the literature, you will find some funny terms. People will talk about the covariant wave or the covariant field. What is it? So the covariant wave is defined exactly like so. Is the wave, the part of the field that propagates exactly in straight line. Okay? Alors, how can you access this covariant wave? Is by taking an ensemble average. So if you imagine that you have many realizations of the disorder, and so these heterogeneities are going to move around, you're going to destroy the scattered waves because they will be incoherent. Okay? So we'll come back on the definition. And you will be left with what? With just a plane wave. Okay? And this plane wave, the mathematical definition of the plane wave is really the ensemble average of the field. Okay, so we note it like this. Okay. So we have the mean field, and so the mean field is really the same as the covariant wave, and it's covariant because it has never lost this initial propagation direction. Okay, it propagates in straight line, but of course, as it propagates, it dies out. Okay, because you have the scattering. So this plane wave, okay, it decays like so, okay. So you have a wave number here, and the particularity that you have in the scattering medium is that the wave number is not a real number; it's an imaginary number, okay. So I call it E for an effective wave number. So when you took the ensemble average, you get a wave number that is imaginary, with a phase velocity, okay, which is different from the average velocity in the medium. I will discuss that a bit later. And you get a quantity, super important quantity, and this because if you don't know this quantity, you don't know it, you cannot say anything about how much multiple scattering you have. L, it's what is called the scattering mean free path. Okay. So MFP for mean free path. Okay? So it tells you the rate of transfer of the energy from the coherent wave to all the scattered waves that we call incoherent. So incoherent means that at some point in your history, you have changed your direction from the initial propagation direction. That's what it means, incoherent. And this is because and so indeed you lose. You don't then your phase is different from the phase of the covariant wave, and when you average over the disorder, you get rid of all these waves. Okay, so when you take the ensemble average, the incovariant waves are destroyed. Okay. But in the real Earth experiment, we don't do ensemble average. Okay, so what we get the coherent wave that we have here, plus all these inccoherent waves, okay, which form the coda. Okay, and as you can see, so I introduced the mean free path. So I define the mean free path as a parameter which characterizes the attenuation, the spatial attenuation of the wave due to scattering. But you see that it occurs also here. It's the same L here, it's the same mean free path. And the mean free path is also the same quantity that describes the typical distance between two scattering events. Okay? So there are two definitions, and it's the same L. Okay? It's very important. It's the same mean free path. So the average distance between two scattering events is the mean free path, and it's also the scale length that characterizes the attenuation of the coherent wave. Okay? So now it allows us, once we know the mean free path, we can classify. Yes? Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, because it's a single realization. It's a good remark. So on a single realization, if you look at the transmitted field, it's distorted. When you do the ensemble average, okay, then you restore the translational symmetry in a sense, and so the plane wave remains a plane wave. Okay. Okay, because then you have the translational invariance. Okay, and so K is conserved. Okay, but you have the attenuation that appears. So this is a single realization. If I ensemble average, okay, I will have a plane wave. Okay, that will propagate with its own velocity. Okay, an effective velocity. That depends on the scattering properties. Okay. Yes, you change. Yeah. So you imagine that you have an ensemble of media that are characterized by the same correlation function, okay, and you sample them randomly, okay. So you average. You imagine that this scatter moves around, so the statistical properties of the medium are the same, but the places of all these blobs changes, okay, randomly. So again, in the Earth, we never have access to the coherent wave. We cannot do ensemble average, okay. Yes. Yeah. You can do that. Absolutely. Yeah. It works. Yeah. You can. It's absolutely true. Yeah. But you can. Yeah. But you can do. You can do that. That's true. Yes. Absolutely. All these quantities are frequency dependent. Okay. I will discuss that. It's a good remark. Sorry? For the moment, we are purely elastic. Yeah. So yeah, it's very important because here there's no dissipation. Energy has gone somewhere. It's just that the energy that has been lost by the coherent wave are now in incoherent wave. And we will see, we will come back, we will explain how to describe the transfer of energy from coherent to incoherent. Okay? So yeah, so now, oui. Absolutely. I will discuss. Yeah. I will show an example. I will discuss the frequency dependence of the mean free path. So just after that. Absolutely. We are going to gain more insight into the mean free path and what's the relation between this guy and this guy. Okay. In fact, they usually differ largely. Mean free path is usually much larger than the correlation distance, if it exists. Yes. Yeah, it depends. Yeah, I will discuss that. Absolutely. Okay, so now once we have this concept of mean free path, we can classify the propagation regime. Very important, because depending on the propagation regime, you have different theories and different approximations that apply. Okay, so if this typical propagation distance is much smaller than the mean free path, okay, then your field, you have very little incoherent wave. You didn't have time to generate them, so you are completely dominated by the coherent wave. And it's the case in the Earth, depending on the frequency. This is very likely. If you are a long period, this guy will dominate. And then you can apply this type of mean field theories, and you can, for example, work out on the velocities and stuff like that. Okay. It has to be.
So it's not
No. But wait. This is the you can have the mean free path can be anything you want compared to your propagation distance. Huh? Okay, but you still, if you want this to make sense, you must at least go through some heterogeneities. But if you go through a medium that is very dilute, okay, the mean free path is huge, but you can still propagate through many heterogeneities, no problem. Okay, so from now on, in fact, the correlation distance it will somehow disappear. Now we'll talk with mean free path only. We are going to work at the different level now. We are not going to, I mean, I will come back on the correlation, but it's not so important. Really, the important concept is the mean free path.
well, okay. When you speak about the Earth, I guess the problem here
Yeah.
is the fact that, of course, on Earth it's not just I mean, it's a plane wave, but still there are like discontinuities, like large scale stuff.
It's a thought experiment. Huh?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I understand that. So yeah, exactly. That's
Yeah.
that's the difference.
It's a thought experiment. Huh? It's not the real Earth. Huh? It's to explain the concept. Okay. So in the Earth, you have layers. You have you have all this. Okay. Yeah, it's a chunk of medium. Okay. So yeah, so yeah, just come back to this. So when the mean free path is large to your propagation distance, this guy dominates, the coherent wave dominates, and you can use mean field theory. When the propagation distance starts to be of the order of the mean free path, then you start to see scattering effects. And in fact, in short period seismology, we are always in this regime. Okay. So in a transition between, in fact, and single scattering almost never applies. Huh? I'm going to say it immediately. Single scattering theories are not doing any good job, except for some examples I'm going to show. When you look at deep in the mantle, usually when you go through the crust, you have some multiple scattering going on always, and in other places also probably. I'm thinking about the top of the inner core, for example. And then to describe this regime, what we have is transport theory. Okay, so I'm going to tell you what it is, and so we have a transport equation which is different from the equation. You know, it's not the diffusion equation, it's not the wave equation. It's something in between. It has some properties of the wave equation and some properties of the diffusion equation. And now, if you go to the moon, where the propagation distance is very large compared to the mean free path, then things simplify considerably. We will get what we call an equipartition. I will explain what it is. And to describe the transport of the energy, okay, not of the field. Now we are going to look at the transport of the energy through the medium. Then you can apply a diffusion model, okay. And it's want to insist, it's not phenomenological. You can prove that if you can prove mathematically that if you look at the energy that goes through this type of medium upon ensemble averaging, it verifies a diffusion equation, and you can compute the diffusion constant based on the statistical properties of the medium. Okay, just to say that it's not just an artistic view. Okay, it's life, and it's what you see in experiments and numerical experiments in the lab. And in fact, all this story about diffuse field now comes from room acoustics. If you have acoustic wave reverberating in this type of room, the field becomes diffuse, and the rays propagate in straight line except at the boundaries. Okay. So we are going to discuss a little bit more now, but you had the question about what is the relation between the mean free path and the correlation length. Okay, so it's a plot I took actually from, there have been a lot of work on the mean field attenuation in the field of non-destructive testing. So people looking at the propagation of ultrasound wave in polycrystals. So this is an example. I think, I don't remember if it's aluminium. These are cubic crystals. And so on this, you have two axes. So here it's a frequency. It's non-dimensionalized. Okay. So actually, the parameter that you have on this axis, it's, I think, the circular frequency times the correlation length. So in polycrystal, you can define a correlation length, as this is the typical size of the grain, and divided by the Voigt average velocity. Okay. So this is the parameter on this axis, and on this axis, it's just so it's the attenuation. So it's the inverse mean free path alpha. So alpha equals 1 over the mean free path times well, it's the average grain size, okay? So this is an inverse length, this is a length, so this is adimensional, and this is also adimensional. But here it's frequency, and here it's attenuation, okay? So probably everyone has heard about the Rayleigh regime, okay? So everybody knows about that. So when your heterogeneities are very large compared, your wavelength is very large compared to the typical size of your heterogeneities, then, this should be alpha here, okay? It's the attenuation that increases, huh? Okay, it's not this L minus 1. So the attenuation increases like the force power of K, which is the wave number of the wave, okay? So K is just omega divided by the Voigt average velocity in that case, times the size of the grains to the force power, okay? So this is all the story of Rayleigh scattering, the blue light, etc., the blue color of the sky, and we're going to comment on that. Yes? There's only scattering attenuation here. It's a theory. Huh? Actually, now people are doing numerical experiments where and this works extremely well. So this theory is extremely precise and very predictive, and you can predict not only the attenuation but also the effect on the velocity. Because in fact, the true velocity is not the Voigt average. We discussed a little bit about that yesterday during Andrea's talk. I can maybe comment very briefly, but there can be significant shift of the velocity compared to the Voigt average velocity. But I just said that in passing. Another regime which you might have heard of is a geometric regime. So when you go to very high frequency, you reach an asymptote where the mean free path is just basically equal to the size of heterogeneity. So there is one way. The geometric regime is well known when you have a single object. You know that when you go to very high frequency, the scattering cross section, so which describes basically the efficiency of an object to attenuate the wave by scattering, okay, becomes equal to twice its geometrical section, okay. So again, this is standard. You can find that in many textbooks. Yes.
For the geometrical regime, L is mean free path.
Yeah.
And for the regime, you say it's attenuation, though? So
Yeah. It's here. I should put alpha. It's my mistake.
Okay, so the two first lines.
It's alpha, and here it's L.
Here it's L.
Yeah. Thank you for asking the question. I thought I had cleaned up my slides, but I left some error. But in general, it's good because people then remember. But yeah. So thanks for pointing that out. Yeah. It's alpha. Okay. And here it's L. Okay. So.
What do you say? Okay, alpha is 1 over L, but it's dimensionless because it's proportional, right?
But this is the length. Huh? This is the size of the grain. Huh?
No,
okay.
I agree for the last one, but the other one, 1 over L is 1 over length.
Minus 4, minus 2.
Or if you want, it's -4 here if you keep L, or -2 if you keep L.
What I'm saying is that Ka is dimensionless.
Yes, yeah.
But L
is not dimensionless, of course. Yeah. No, absolutely. Yeah, there's a factor. Yeah, it's a proportionality sign. Here I put an equal, but here's a proportionality. Yeah. Absolutely. So in fact, when you have a single scatterer, you know that there's a geometric regime. When you have many scatterers, okay, there is an equivalent regime, okay. This is the geometric regime, and basically what it tells you is that, well, at very high frequency, when you exit a grain, you are attenuated. But of course it's true when you do an ensemble average, okay, because basically through one grain you will just basically diffract your rays, okay. But when you take the average over many realizations, okay, then when you exit the grain on average, you will be completely attenuated. Okay, so that's the idea, and okay. And there is another regime which is probably less well known, which is also very well characterized. Is the stochastic regime. Okay, so this is something that occurs in between the Rayleigh regime and the geometric regime, and it has a different scaling. Okay, but I mention it because it's pretty universal. You have it for any type of wave. You have it for acoustic wave, elastic waves. And there's the stochastic regime, and we will see that it corresponds to a special regime when we are going to look at how the energy is diffracted, okay? How the energy is scattered angularly. We're going to see that it corresponds to a specific regime of scattering. Okay, I'm going to illustrate that in the next slide. Something I did not talk about. So we can make prediction about the scattering attenuation, but we can also make prediction about the velocity. And actually, so when just a comment on the literature, for example, on all the literature on the inner core, so you have a bunch of mineralogical models. Okay, so these mineralogical models, when you want to compare them to the seismic models, you have to do something. Okay, so what people usually do, and this is what Andrea explained, you do the Voigt average. Okay. However, Voigt average is okay as long as the material heterogeneity is not too large. But if you have grains, so if you imagine a polycrystal, okay, in a polycrystal, if the grains are randomly oriented, every time you cross a boundary, you see a different elastic tensor, different realization of the elastic tensor. So you have scattering at each of the boundaries. Okay. So in fact, a polycrystal, you can view it as an heterogeneous material. Okay. And these theories, okay, they tell you that the effective velocity can be much significantly smaller than the Voigt average velocity. So suppose you take, we did that exercise with Marie Calvé a few years ago. We took all the mineralogical models from the literature, and we worked out this theory, and we look at the velocity. And we noticed that, for example, you start from a Voigt velocity of 4, okay? So we say, wow, it's super high compared to the seismic velocity, which is 3.5. Okay? But then you compute the effective velocity, the true seismic velocity. And then you find it's 3.6. So when you say it's 4, you say, oh, it has a large difference, so there must be some melt inside. But actually, no. It's just that you're not taking the correct average, okay? And if you take the correct average, you find that the recent mineralogical model for the inner core, at least the one we used, it was 10 years ago, they were pretty close with the seismic velocity. So just a side comment, okay? So these theories are also important to make the link between some seismic observations and the mineralogical models. But it's not my main topic. I go on. Yeah, so I discussed about the frequency regimes. So I showed you there is the Rayleigh regime. So when the wavelength of the wave is very large compared to the alternatives, then I said there is an intermediate frequency regime which I call stochastic, okay? And then the geometric regime. And so what changes in this between these different regimes is also the scattering pattern, okay? So when a wave is scattered, okay, so it scatters everywhere, it's a bit complicated, but you can nevertheless define the scattering pattern, okay? And so you have this experiment, you have a plane wave which arrives on your scattering objects, okay, which are distributed a bit everywhere. It arrives in this direction k prime, and then we look at how the energy is deflected into direction k. So k prime is here, it's this horizontal direction, and this is the angular pattern for the scattering. And you see that it's very, very frequency dependent, okay? So this is an example for a medium where you have correlated fluctuation of velocity and density. So basically, when the velocity increases, the density increases. So that makes a variation of the impedance. So when you look at long period, so low frequency, you see the contrast of impedance in the medium. So the energy arrives on the heterogeneities and gets scattered backward. Okay. So here it's a polar plot. You can look at the axis. It's not very, very anisotropic. Okay, the pattern is not very anisotropic. Depending on the heterogeneities, it can be more or less in the backward direction. Okay, but you see that it's anisotropic and it goes backward, and it's relatively smooth. Okay, these type of things, okay, are related. What we see here is what I have put here. Okay, so this guy for elastic waves. So if we let me back up 1 second. If we were working with scalar waves, okay, wave with no polarization, okay, this scattering pattern, okay, the angular distribution is completely governed by this thing here, which is the power spectrum of heterogeneities. Okay, this is the thing that I introduced. Okay, here the power spectrum of heterogeneities. So what the scattering experiment does for you, it scans the power spectrum of heterogeneities. Okay, when you look at different angles, you are looking at different values here of the wave number. So you see different values of the power spectrum of heterogeneities. Okay? So for scalar waves, this is the only factor that matters. So if you are at very, very long period, basically, so you are looking at, let me go back, the plateau here. You're looking at this plateau. The long wavelengths are here. So what happens is that the scattering is independent of the exit direction k. So you have isotropic scattering, okay? Because your wavelength is very long, your wave number is very small, so you are on the plateau and you don't see. You see the waves are scattered isotropically, okay? They cannot see really how the disorder is, and there is no preferential direction for scattering, okay? It's just as if you had point scatters, okay? For elastic waves, the things are a bit more complicated because they are polarized, okay? So here maybe the notation is not good, but indeed you can factor this function here which describes the non-isotropy of the scattering. They are indeed a product of this term and this term. So this term I did not maybe write it very well, but because it depends on the polarization of the wave. So it means it depends on the incident and outgoing polarization. And of course, it depends also on the incident and outgoing propagation direction. Okay? So this is different for different type of waves. So for electromagnetic wave, you get a different factor from elastic wave. And acoustic waves are also polarized. Acoustic waves, they respond differently depending on the assumption you're going to make on the correlation between the fluctuation of density and velocity. Okay? Here what I mean is that this is a function of the ways the elastic parameters are correlated. Okay? So in the Rayleigh regime, you don't see this guy, and you have access to this part. Okay? Because this guy, you can change k and k prime, you are on the plateau, so phi doesn't change. Okay? Now, when you start to arrive in the stochastic regime, now you start to see your heterogeneities. That is, you are reaching, your wave number is sufficiently small, and you start to probe this part here. Okay? And then, so you start to see the small scales. And then you can get rather complicated patterns which completely depend on this guy here. Okay? So basically, if you can do a scattering experiment, basically you can measure this thing here. So you can have access to the full description of the fluctuation. And what makes it impossible in practice, except in a few exceptions, is that we have multiple scattering. Okay? And then in the end, we have the geometric regime. And you see here the scale, minus 2, 2. Okay? So as you go to higher and higher frequencies, it's more and more anisotropic. And this cone of direction here that gives you the anisotropy of the scattering becomes smaller and smaller as you increase the frequency. Okay? So to characterize the level of anisotropy, we introduce a parameter which is called G, so completely different from the G of Barbara, which is just the weighted average, okay, of this function here with the cosine of the scattering angle. So basically, if you have a lot of backscattering, this guy will be negative. If you have isotropic scattering, this guy is 0, or if you have non-preferential scattering, if you prefer. And if scattering is in the forward direction, this guy will be positive. So it's a way of having an idea of how anisotropic your scattering is. Okay, now I'm going to show you a real Earth experiment of single scattering. Okay, and this is a very famous example of the PKP precursors. So I try to be as fast as possible. So what are these precursors? So it's a bit complicated. So you know that in the Earth, you have the shadow zone. Okay, the shadow zone which is related to the presence of the liquid outer core. So you have this huge effect of the refraction of the rays. Okay, and you have here I've represented the set of rays. Okay, that propagate through the liquid outer core. Okay, and which are the AB. We call AB and BC branches. Okay, and here at B, you have basically a transition between light and shadow. Here it's acoustic, so if there was not this annoying inner core here, there would be no ray here. Okay, so forget about these rays. Let's assume there's no solid inner core, you would have a place in the Earth where there's nothing that arrives, at least at a sufficiently high frequency, because there can be some diffraction, but okay, let's forget about this. So there is a place where you are in the shadow. There are no direct rays that show up, okay? Unfortunately for the scattering guy, there is this inner core here that refract some rays into the shadow zone, and which forms this wave here, the PKIKP. But in fact, what has been observed some time ago, it's an old observation, is that before the PKIKP, which is this wave here that propagates through the top of the inner core, you see some arrivals. And this is what people have called PKP precursors. So it's a bad name because it's not really precursor, it's the name that was given, but based on this observation, because it was precursory to PKP, but it has nothing to do with this. It's not due to the scattering here. It's due to the scattering in the mantle. Okay. So in fact, what you can show is that if you scatter waves here at the base of the mantle, you are going to produce. You can explain completely the kinematic, that is the arrival times of these precursory arrivals. Okay. And this interpretation, in terms of scattering of these outer core phases, the fact that these are these outer core phases that scatter to form the precursory waves, it has been confirmed by a ray experiment where you can measure the incidence angle of the ray, so we know where it comes from. Okay. Now, if we take many observations, so so see it's a bit complicated. There are large amplitude here, small amplitude here. Here the transition between the precursor and the DF is not really clear. But when you do an ensemble average, ensemble in the sense of averaging over path, you get something which is much clearer. Okay. So here I represent these are envelopes, okay, of this amplitude envelope of the signal. Okay. So here we are close to this border here. So close to the transition between light and shadow, okay? And here we are deep in the shadow zone. And what is quite clear is that the amplitude of these arrivals decays strongly with the distance into the shadow zone. So the deeper you go into the shadow zone, the less scattered energy you have, okay? So how do you interpret that? Just as I said before, when you do a scattering experiment, you scan basically the power spectrum between 0 and twice the central wave number of the waves, okay? Between 0 and 2K. So what we see here is basically, so you have your power spectrum, and what we see the decay of the energy as we increase the wave number of the probing wave, okay? This is what single scattering theory tells you. And this decay, so then what this decay tells you, in fact, it gives you access to your power spectrum, okay? So we can measure the power spectrum. Actually, we did something a bit different. We did some inversion, taking into account possibly the effect of multiple scattering. And this is what we obtain. So here it's a zoom on the precursory data. So the DF wave is here. So in black, these are the data with uncertainties. So when the amplitude is not large, uncertainties are quite large. And in red, it's a model. It's the model. So it's a 3D model. It's 3D. You have a background. You have all the variation of the background velocities. So we have in this model there is it was, I think we took Prem for the background, and we just add very weak fluctuations on top of that, okay? And we were able to predict here the amplitude of these precursors, okay? So this I did with the Pentium 3 20 years ago. so not very difficult to do, and we can get quite some information. So in fact, what we found that the best fitting power spectrum has a dependence like m to the -3. So remember, I said that it was also what people find when they look at a sample. One interesting thing is that the fluctuation that we need to put are extremely small, so really much less than 1%. So it's not the same order of magnitude that people see when they look at when you look at tomography in the double prime. People put much larger fluctuation. So here fluctuations are very small. Correlation length, well, we don't resolve it because basically if you want to resolve the correlation length, you have to be at very, very small scattering angle, and then it becomes very difficult to separate the coherent and incoherent wave. Okay, so we just have a control of the slope here. And what is interesting, what we found is that in the modeling, we could not explain the duration of this precursor without putting heterogeneities way above the classical D double prime, at least 600 kilometers above the CMB. Okay. Yeah, we average. Yeah, the data are average over different corridors. Yeah. If you, yeah, maybe the question you imply if there are fluctuations among different. Yeah. Yes.
For example, LSDPs and.
Yes. No, there are. In fact, it's. Absolutely. Yeah. I see. Yeah, absolutely. Yes. And in fact, there are fluctuations among different corridors. No, it's a trade-off. I could show you what the inversion gives, and there's a trade-off. We can basically fit with any correlation length we want. We just need to adjust this guy. But this guy is very strongly constrained. Huh? If you just increase a little bit the fluctuation, you completely the onset here of this precursor is super dependent on how much fluctuation you put. Huh? So this is very well constrained. The correlation length is not constrained. And this thing, there have been other people who did this much better than what we did at the time, and who basically reached the same conclusion. Yes. It's huge. Yeah. The mean free pass, I think, is thousands of kilometers. So this is why it's like this is why I say it's a single scattering experiment. The mean free pass is huge. So, but it's not surprising. Huh? You have ballistic waves that propagate through the mantle. Huh? If the mean free pass was very short, yeah, it would be completely contradictory. Huh? You mean if we have the resolution on that? Not with this data. But there are many more data. We use very few data at that time. Huh? It was 20 years ago. We had 200. It's an average over 200 records. And I think there are thousands. We can have thousands. I think in the most recent papers, people have used thousands of records. So it would be interesting to come back. And I have some ideas about these very fluctuations, if they are real or not. I wonder. Because in fact, there's a very strong assumption in the model is that the statistical fluctuations are isotropic. So if you think that this heterogeneity, for example, has been rejected by convection, there are many reasons to think that the scale lengths are not isotropic. And this changes the problem a lot. But okay, it's for the future. Yeah, at least in the last 30 minutes, I want to talk about this, the transport model. I don't know if I will probably not have time to go to the advanced topic, but never mind. I want really to explain the separation of absorption and scattering because it's a recurrent discussion, how you separate scattering from absorption, and why you can't separate scattering from absorption if you only have ballistic waves. Okay, so I will try to explain this and okay, to get started, so I need to introduce a little bit this transport model. Okay, so what is the idea of this transport model? Is to describe not all the complicated oscillations. Huh? This is way beyond what we can do. We just want to explain why the amplitude varies. So what we want to explain is that the slow modulation of the amplitude of the signal, slow compared to the fast oscillation of the wave. Okay. The envelope. And, it's good, I want immediately to emphasize something. Here, you have time and you have frequency. These are not the Fourier conjugate variables. Huh? The time here, it's a slow time. It's the time of the envelope, okay, which is very slowly, okay. The frequency here is the frequency of the oscillation. which varies very, very rapidly. So it's a time frequency analysis. So if you want to think in very simply, it means that we are looking at a narrow band signal filtered around the frequency omega. Okay. So for me, it was a source of huge source of confusion when I got started into this. Well, there is time, there is frequency. Usually omega and t, they are conjugate variable. No, there is another hidden in the theory. There is a, because here I just put the equation like that. Okay. But you can derive it. And hidden in the theory, there is another frequency which describes basically it's a modulation frequency, okay?
So that assumes a good separation of scale.
Absolutely, you need separation. Yeah. At least mathematically, yeah. If you want to do a thing, yeah, you have separation of scale. But in our case, to me, it looks like it's okay. And you will see that the model actually explains the data, can explain data quite well. Okay, so here, so we have this equation. So here I have put, normally people write with a scattering mean free path and an absorption length, okay? So here I use the seismological notation where people prefer to use inverse scattering for scattering attenuation and inverse intrinsic quality factor for the absorption or attenuation length, or attenuation, which is inverse of absorption length, okay? And so it's a quantity, the quantity that is in this equation here is what people call, as a fancy word, the specific intensity, irradiance, etc. So it's a quantity that you can determine from the wave field. It's not something independent. It's in fact it's the correlation function of the wave field. But it's something that depends. Again, we have a description where we have space and propagation direction. It's weird. Not weird. I mean, it's just we have time frequency analysis and we have position wave number description. Okay. So here is the position, okay, and here is the propagation direction. So it's a angularly resolved flux of energy. Okay. It tells you how much energy flows through a surface here in a particular direction. Okay. But I mean, if you think in terms of wave, it's related to the correlation properties of the wave field. In this equation, you see here again the function that I described previously, which describes the scattering anisotropy. So basically, it tells you when you have a wave that arrives in direction k prime, how much energy is deflected into direction k. And I think we know everything. You have the velocity, this you know, okay. And so the structure of this equation, the source, yeah, is the quake, boom. This is the source term. It's localized. Yeah, absolutely. This is why you put the quake, and you can put a radiation pattern. Okay. So here it's a scalar. I just showed the scalar wave equation. Sorry, scalar transport equation. But you can write it for elastic waves. It's exactly the same structure, except that everything becomes vectorial here. Okay. So to understand the physics, you don't need to go to the elastic case. And so if you go to the literature, this transport equation, and they show up everywhere in the literature. People who do non-destructive evaluation, there's a lot of activity in medical imaging, optics, astrophysics. You will find it. You will find it everywhere. As soon as you have some disorder, people use this equation when they are interested in describing globally the transport of the energy. And it's an equation that you can establish from the wave equation. If you are very patient, it takes 50 pages and some hours of sweat. Took me a long time to understand, but okay, I can give you the reference in the literature. You can find in mathematics, in physics. There are different ways to do that. But okay, there is a link with the wave equation. So the frequency here, we just used the frequency is here, okay. But in fact, all the parameters depend on the frequency. Attenuation depends on the frequency. We saw that. We showed that the mean free path depends on the frequency. The scattering anisotropy depends on the frequency. So the frequency is a bit hidden in the equation, but it's everywhere. Okay. So from now on, I will take this equation for granted. Okay, that will be my level of description. Okay. I don't care anymore about the relation with the wave equation. This is a new level of description. Okay. Just like when you do diffusion, if you want to describe it really the microscopic scale, it's not a diffusion. It's not a diffusion equation. It's when you look at macroscopically. So here it will be my level of discussion. So I forget about the wave equation, and this is the tool I'm going to use to try to explain this data. Okay, so if you go to the literature, for example, astrophysics literature, people will explain to you that you can interpret this as an energy balance. This is absolutely correct. This is the classical explanation. I like to see it a bit differently, and to see it as like a random walk, in fact. So if you let's forget about this term here, okay, which I call the multiple scattering term. So if we forget this term and we just look at this equation, we have the source here, and we have this differential operator, okay. So for those who are familiar, they will probably recognize something that is like a one-way wave equation. So what this operator, this differential operator, describes is the covariant propagation, in fact. Okay. If you put a point source here, you will get a spherical expanding front, okay, that propagates at its velocity c, and that attenuates due to the combined effect of scattering and absorption. Okay. So this describes the covariant propagation. And this term here is the term that generates the multiple scattering. So in fact, you can solve this equation iteratively, and then what you do, you are generating a multiple scattering series. That is, you forget about this term, you inject this term, you get, so you are at your source, you get the covariant propagation from your source to the first scattering point, and then you have this multiple scattering term which tells you that you are changing direction, okay? Then you propagate coherently to the next scattering event, then you get scattered again, and so you can view this equation like something that represents in a compact way the multiple scattering series. So it contains everything. It contains the covariant propagation, it contains single scattering, double, triple, etc., etc., etc. Okay? So, yes?
Yeah, I mean, okay, I was expecting something that is basically a diffusion term.
We are going, no, in fact, it does diffusive behavior, this guy.
Multiple scattering.
Yeah, this.
So the integral is a surface integral?
Yes, absolutely. You integrate over all the propagation. I didn't go into the details of the equation, just want to give you the general idea. But this is an integral over all the propagation directions, okay? So this tells you that basically, so if you want to, this is the variation of intensity in direction k, okay? And you get, so of course, you lose energy due to scattering and absorption, but you gain energy due to the wave that come from direction k prime and that gets scattered into direction k. So in this sense, it is a conservation equation. You can view it as a kind of detail balance, okay, where you basically stipulate that energy is conserved. But I present it a bit differently here because I like this picture of random walk, okay? Because in fact, numerically is the way you solve it. By simulating many random walks. And in fact, as you have seen, there is a differential in integral terms. So in effect, what the random walk does, it computes a lot of integrals. And as you know, so we do Monte Carlo method for that, and they are far more efficient than any deterministic method when you have high-dimensional integrals to compute. Okay, because single scattering is already you have two variables plus the space variable. Okay, and as you iterate, the number of dimensions becomes huge, and in that case, no way you're going to do that deterministically. Is it okay? Almost. Yeah. So we come to your question, diffusion limit. Okay. So Stefan mentioned. He said, yeah, I expect some diffusion term, etc. In fact, diffusion is built in. Okay. So diffusion, it will apply. So usually you write the diffusion equation for an energy density, which is just basically up to a scaling factor related to the velocity, just the integrated intensity. Okay. So then basically you forget about the propagation direction here. You integrate over all propagation direction. And so when you have many scattering events, in fact, what the transport equation tells you is that you behave diffusively with a diffusion constant, which is basically the velocity, the mean free path, okay, and the space dimension. And this is true. Here you have the mean free path because here the assumption that is usually done is that the scattering is isotropic. So for isotropic scattering, you have the the mean free path appears directly in the definition of the diffusion constant. Okay, so this is what is represented in, and you have many steps. And if you look at what happens after many steps, you have a diffusion model for the energy density, and it's exactly the diffusion equation that everybody knows. Huh? Except that now we have a mean free path that depends on the disorder, the correlation properties. Of course, in the Earth, it's more complicated. We said the scattering is non-isotropic. And then we are going to meet again our good friend G, which measures the scattering anisotropy. And why does a different scale length now? So we have a different scale length, which is this L star here, which we call the transport mean free path because it governs the large distance transport properties. Is because now instead of having a memoryless random walk, we have a persistent random walk. That is, when you come from a specific direction here, if the scattering is non-isotropic, your direction will not change much after one scattering event. Okay, so it will take many scattering events before you lose the memory of your initial direction. So you have to take many steps of scattering if the scattering is anisotropic. Okay, and so you have a new scale length that takes into account this, what people call persistent random walks, the fact that, well, if the scattering is non-isotropic, and it is non-isotropic in the Earth, so the diffusion constant is different, okay? And this concept of transport mean free path, it's quite important. I'm not going to insist about it, but it's important to have in mind this in particular because, let's go. In fact, because in the real experiment, we always measure simultaneously the coherent and incoherent wave. And in fact, I invite you to see the poster of Sabrina. On Mars, we think that we are in a regime where this guy is much larger than this guy. And why that? Because on Mars, we see something that looks like PNS, so we have two arrivals. But when you look at the polarization, you see that everything is already multiply scattered. There is no polarization information. The motion is completely random, yet it looks like a P, it looks like an S. But what happens is that we have already taken many steps, okay? But because at each step, we just change a little bit the propagation direction of the ray, in fact, what we measure, in fact, is more the transport mean free path than the mean free path. And this guy can be much larger than this guy, because you see, in the definition, it's L divided by 1 minus G. So in particular, if there is a lot of scattering in the forward direction, this L star can be huge compared to L. And on Mars, we are probably in this regime. But I invite you to see Sabrina's poster. Okay, 15 minutes, I will just have time to finish my second part. Here, I just wanted to show you some numerical simulation to give you a sense of the difference between all the things that are contained in this equation. To show you really, in the simulation, the coherent and incoherent part. So it's an experiment, it's a numerical experiment, very simple. We have a half space, we have a free surface here. So it's elastic, okay, 3D. I'm not going to enter into the disorder, very simple. So point cloud density perturbation, super simple model. Already the scattering is not isotropic in this model because there are density fluctuations, so it's not isotropic. And I take a mean free path of 10 seconds. It's not important. It's important is to see the dynamics. So here I have my explosion. Okay, so you know an explosion, right? That's only P waves. So here you have the P energy. Here you have what is it? I think this is SV, and here it is SH. Okay, so SV is the polarization that vibrates in this plane, and SH perpendicular to this plane. Okay, so because of the explosion source, we have an azimuthal symmetry, so I can just show cross section. And so I like this picture because it shows you that the transport equation contains a lot of things. For example, so you see the UCD emitted wavefront, you have a nice P wave. It reflects at the surface, so you get the PP reflection. Okay. At the same time, you have the P to SV reflection. Okay. But you see also that you have all these diffuse halos here. And what is remarkable, you see that their dynamics is completely different. Okay. So this propagates with the wave velocity, but this diffuse halo propagates completely at its own speed, which is in fact closely related to the diffusion properties. Okay. And what's interesting is that even if you have a P source, okay, because of the heterogeneity, you are also generating your ghost. You have ghost SV and SH sources because you have conversions immediately near the source, okay? And so you see the expanding diffusive wave, and we could look at the details, but okay. So just to give you a feeling of the richness of the model, okay? It really contains a lot of physics, and at the same time, it is super well predicted. So in this example, I'm showing you the comparison between the model and the diffusion theory. So we are looking at super long time scale compared to what we usually do in seismology. So here the time scale is the mean free time, so it's 10 seconds. So we are looking here. Normally, when you look at the crust, we rarely exceed this time here. But for this particular model, here I represent in black the result of the numerical simulation, so this is a solution of the transport equation, and here is the output of diffusion theory. And except at early times where you are missing the correlate wave, you see that in this example, I do it on purpose, the diffusion model works extremely well. And quite interestingly, also associated to the multiple scattering, I want to discuss about this equipartition. Different distances. Sorry. Yes, thank you for asking. Yeah. So I just have plotted the result of 4 different distances. Okay. So just to show a little bit the different dynamics. And of course, this thing here is totally dominated by the S wave. Okay. Although you have P wave, you have very strong conversion to S, and in fact, you have much more than that. You have an equipartition when you have multiple scattering. So equipartition, what it is, it tells you that basically, because at each time you have scattering, you randomize the mode of propagation. That is, they're coupled all together. And what the transport equation tells you is that you are going to fill in the modes equally. So you're going to basically equidistribute your energy on all the propagating modes. Implication of that. So this is a log scale. So here you have 1. Here you have the ratio between the SH and SV energy. And you see that after a few tens of, 10 scattering events, something like that, you have equilibrated the amount of energy between SH and SV, okay? The polarization are mixed. But very important, you see also the S to P ratio. But this time, this guy is almost factor 10. Why is it this factor of 10? It's because, as I said, you want to distribute the energy over all the possible propagating modes, okay? And there are far more S than P modes just because of the difference of velocity. So for the people who are familiar with the concept, what we see here is the ratio of the density of states. We fill in all the possible states with equal probability, and so you get in the end, in fact, there is an analytical formula, is the equipartition ratio R is 2. The factor of 2 is because we have 2 degrees of freedom for the S wave, and this is the ratio of the wave speed to the power, so here it's 3 dimensions, the cube. And you see that this process, in fact, is quite fast. In fact, we can show that the relaxation here is exponential, okay? Exponentially fast, and the time is the coupling time between P and S. So if P and S are strongly coupled, then you will get very quickly to equipartition. But you see that in any case, although you inject a lot of P energy, very quickly in the coda, you are dominated by less energy. Because the scattering favors, and this is something that is independent, which is very important, very important, is that this is totally independent of the disorder. So anywhere you play, you will go there. You cannot escape, and you will not escape diffusion either. You will not escape equipartition, and you will not escape diffusion. So this is the justification, and in fact, this was understood by people a long time ago, that the coda was completely dominated by less wave. But now we have a complete model to explain that. Okay.
And so this energy is integrated over all the wavelengths or periods of the scene.
No, it's the dynamics that you see here. You see, this is the equivalent here. Instead of representing the whole energy, I represent the energy ratio. So these are different distances.
In terms of frequency.
No, you are always working narrowband. Yeah. So this equipartition time, of course, depends on the coupling between P and S, which is dependent on frequency. So, and it depends. The coupling time depends a lot on the disorder. It can be extremely large. Okay, so it can take very long time, but it's always exponential. Okay. Another thing here is the relaxation towards isotropy. I said that you want to fill in all the propagation direction. Okay, so you are basically going to make your field isotropic. So here I present an average of the distribution of intensity as a function of angle. Okay, and this is for the P, SH, SV. I'm not going to comment on this for a long time because I want really to discuss the problem of separation. But this guy, this isotropy, takes much longer. It's algebraic in time. Because you can prove it easily with the diffusion model. So it takes a very, very long time to make the field isotropic, although you are going to equilibrate the energy quite rapidly. Okay? But this is very useful because of this equilibration, in many of the models, people in fact only use a scalar transfer equation, and it works quite well. Okay, now in one slide, the problem, how you separate. So now that we have discussed all this, I think you have understood something, is that so here these are the results of an analytical model. Don't care about so here I put time, I put energy, okay, but this is just what a simple scalar transport equation tells you for isotropic scattering, okay, but it's just to illustrate the idea. So I guess by now you are convinced that this peak here, which is the peak of the coherent wave, is affected by both absorption and scattering, okay? When the coherent wave, we said it's attenuated by scattering, but it's also attenuated by absorption. Okay, and we have this scaling, so this is the space dimension, and it decays exponentially, and this is just a simple geometrical spreading factor. Okay, so you see that this guy, if you look at this peak here, it decays with the distance, and from the decay with distance, you get the sum of the scattering and absorption. Okay. Now, if you are in the coda, you have when you are in the diffusive regime, you can very easily show that this decay here depends only on the absorption. So now it's easy. If you want to separate scattering and absorption, you want to measure this guy at different distances, and you want to measure this guy at different time, and you're done. Okay, cannot say it more simply. I'm going to give you more example. Okay, so basically the separation is based on this what people call coherent to incoherent energy ratio. So I just extracted one envelope here, okay, of all the one that I showed you, and I show you what happens if you add absorption or if you add scattering, okay. So here it's a zoom on the coherent wave. So if I add the same amount, so these are two, so here I'm just adding absorption for the red, and I'm just adding scattering for the blue, okay, independently, okay. You see that the height of this peak is exactly the same for the two, okay. If I put the same amount of absorption or the same amount of scattering, I cannot differentiate, okay? No possibility to differentiate. Now, if I look at the relative amplitude between this peak and the energy that I have in the coda, then it's obvious that I can make the difference between the two. So this is how the separation works. What matters is really the ratio between this peak and the amplitude of your coda. The absolute, you see that the absolute amplitude of the coda increases, of course, when I increase the scattering, but this is really not relevant, okay? What is really relevant is the ratio between this peak and this level here, okay? Because this level here, okay, it can be changed by anything. It can be changed by the size of the source, okay? So it's only the ratio that matters. Yes? It's a zoom on the coherent wave. Yeah. It's just that you see, because here you don't see anything here. So I just wanted to show you that if you increase the scattering or you increase the absorption, the coherent wave decreases in the same way. So it means you cannot separate. Okay. And yeah, and okay, I'm going to end here. I really want to break the neck of a really super common misbelief among even very experienced colleagues. One thing is very important. If you want to study the scattering, don't go there. Okay. In the coda, you are not far away in the coda. People think, oh, well, I'm going to go very far away in the coda because I'm going to be very sensitive to scattering. No, you are not sensitive at all to the scattering there. And I have many more slides, but it will be for the next time. I could explain in more details why this is the case, but you have strictly no sensitivity to scattering. If you want to study scattering, you have to really, really study what happens around the ballistic peak, and particularly if you want to have access to all the terms, the scattering anisotropy and all that. The sensitivity to scattering is here, around the ballistic peak, not over there, okay? And this is a very common, most common misconception, okay? And the effect is obvious. Scattering is just take some energy, redistribute it, okay? Okay? You take energy from this peak and you put it here, but you completely spread it, okay, over time. Absorption affects the whole signal, okay? So absorption is really, when you are in the coda, you're entirely dominated by the effect of absorption. If you change just a little bit the absorption, you are going to see it, because it's a cumulative effect, okay? You accumulate the exponential decay, and so you see it very strongly. The scattering, it dies out quite rapidly, because you conserve energy, okay? So it's just a redistribution. Here you are removing energy from the system. So you see it very well in the coda, because you have very long propagation path. And okay, I had 30 more slides, so I'm going to stop. Thank you for your attention and questions.
Yeah, I think we need to be seated in 1 minute, so
Yeah. Sorry.
thank you very much, Jody, for your 18 slides.
Yeah, 1 hour and a half.
1 hour.